Welcome back to the Private Archive. If you possess a deep, unrelenting fascination with the forgotten shadows of the 20th century, and if you are driven to understand the complex, often deeply flawed psychology of the people who built the modern world, please make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. We are fiercely dedicated to blowing the thick dust off the most uncomfortable, unbelievable, and heavily suppressed files of the 1950s. Today, we are opening a manila folder that does not contain the grim, bloody photographs of a suburban crime scene, nor does it hold the tragic details of a domestic disappearance. Instead, we are looking at a story of unparalleled, breathtaking audacity. We are examining the absolute zenith of human greed, the blinding power of ego, and a masterclass in psychological manipulation. We are going to explore the unbelievable true story of a man who looked up at the night sky, pointed a manicured finger at the glowing surface of the moon, and successfully sold it, acre by imaginary acre, to some of the wealthiest, most ruthless, and supposedly intelligent corporate titans in the United States of America. To even begin to comprehend how an incredibly educated, battle-hardened 1950s industrialist could ever be convinced to write a massive, six-figure check for a piece of floating space rock that no human being had ever even touched, you must first deeply understand the unique, intoxicating psychological atmosphere of the era. The mid-1950s was a period of absolute, dizzying American exceptionalism. The devastating darkness of the Second World War was firmly in the rearview mirror, and the country was riding the crest of an unprecedented economic tidal wave. Massive interstate highways were violently carving through the pristine landscape. Towering skyscrapers of glass and steel were aggressively reshaping the skylines, and the terrifying, godlike power of the atom had recently been harnessed. For the powerful men sitting in the smoke-filled boardrooms of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, the word impossible had been completely violently deleted from the dictionary. They firmly believed that American industry, fueled by boundless capitalism and rugged determination, could absolutely conquer any physical barrier. And as the early paranoid rumblings of the Cold War space race began to echo through the corridors of power, the night sky was no longer viewed as a romantic, untouchable canopy. It was suddenly aggressively viewed as the ultimate, untapped real estate market. The moon was no longer a celestial body. It was the next great frontier, just waiting to be surveyed, heavily industrialized, and aggressively monetized. It was within this specific, highly volatile atmosphere of boundless arrogance and overflowing bank accounts that our phantom con artist quietly emerged. For the sake of this archive, and because his true identity remains obscured by a labyrinth of carefully constructed aliases and furious, embarrassed cover-ups, we will call him Mr. Sterling. Sterling was not a back-alley thug, and he was not a desperate, fast-talking street hustler peddling cheap snake oil from the back of a dusty station wagon. He was the absolute immaculate embodiment of mid-century corporate elegance. He wore custom-tailored, razor-sharp, worsted wool suits that cost more than a family car. His hair was perfectly brilliantined, his fingernails were flawlessly manicured, and he smelled faintly of expensive imported cologne and fine tobacco. He possessed a terrifyingly calm, deeply authoritative baritone voice that naturally commanded total silence in any room he entered. But Sterling's true genius did not lie in his impeccable wardrobe or his charming demeanor. His genius lay in his profound, predatory understanding of the male ego. He understood that incredibly wealthy, powerful men do not buy products. They do not care about utility. They buy exclusivity. They buy status. They buy the sheer, intoxicating thrill of possessing something that their equally wealthy rivals cannot possibly obtain. Sterling recognized that a man who already owns 4 sprawling mansions, a fleet of luxury automobiles, and a controlling stake in a railroad company is profoundly, fundamentally bored. That man is desperately searching for the ultimate flex, the ultimate conversational piece to casually drop over a glass of 20-year-old scotch at the country club. Sterling did not look at these ruthless businessmen and see intimidating titans of industry. He saw incredibly vulnerable, highly predictable targets whose massive egos had completely blinded them to basic logic. He realized that if you pitch an idea that is so grand, so completely audacious, and so incredibly expensive, the ego of the target will instinctively override their critical thinking. They will desperately want the grand illusion to be true, simply because the idea of owning the moon perfectly aligns with their own deeply inflated sense of self-worth. And with that terrifyingly accurate psychological profile in hand, Sterling began to meticulously construct the greatest, most audacious paper empire the world had ever seen. The actual mechanics of Sterling's grand illusion were a masterclass in the psychology of visual authority. He knew that you cannot simply walk up to a seasoned, cynical corporate executive and ask him to buy a piece of the moon based on a charming smile and a handshake. The modern con requires a mountain of seemingly insurmountable, deeply intimidating paperwork. Sterling invested a small fortune in the physical props of his deception. He hired a disgraced, highly skilled European master forger to create a breathtaking array of legal documents that looked more authentic than the United States Constitution. He carried a heavy, distressed leather briefcase filled with oversized, heavy-stock parchment deeds, featuring intricate, deeply engraved borders, elaborate filigree, and a terrifying amount of dense, impenetrable legal jargon. These documents were stamped with heavy, blood-red wax seals and embossed with the impressive, entirely fabricated crest of the International Lunar Registry. But the most devastating weapon in his leather briefcase was his collection of highly detailed lunar maps. These were not cheap, blurry photographs clipped from an astronomy magazine. These were massive, sprawling, hand-drawn topographical charts that looked exactly like the classified military surveys used by the Department of Defense. They were meticulously divided into distinct commercial zones, residential sectors, and highly coveted mineral-rich craters. When Sterling finally secured a private meeting with a target, usually arranged through a complex web of fake references and perfectly timed introductions at exclusive, high-society charity galas, he did not immediately beg for a sale. He played the role of an incredibly reluctant, highly secretive government insider. He would sit back in a heavy leather armchair, casually light a silver-tipped cigarette, and speak in hushed conspiratorial tones about classified federal initiatives and secret international treaties. He masterfully painted a picture of a rapidly approaching future where the Earth's resources would be completely exhausted and the ultra-wealthy elite would be forced to retreat to heavily fortified, luxurious lunar colonies. He didn't sell dirt. He sold ultimate, untouchable survival. He sold the ultimate legacy. And then he would slowly, dramatically unroll one of his massive topographical maps across the mahogany desk, casually pointing to a prime, highly secure sector located right on the edge of the Sea of Tranquility. The sheer audacity of the pitch was completely neutralized by the overwhelming, intimidating weight of his fabricated evidence. But the most brilliant, counterintuitive aspect of Sterling's entire operation was his aggressive pricing strategy. A desperate, amateur conman would try to sell a fake lunar deed for a few $1,000s, hoping to make a quick, quiet exit. Sterling understood that asking for a small amount of money immediately triggers suspicion in the mind of a wealthy man. Cheap things are scrutinized. Expensive things are revered. Therefore, Sterling did not ask for thousands. He calmly, aggressively demanded hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single lunar sector, often pricing the mineral rights to specific craters in the millions. He required enormous, non-refundable deposits just to secure the pre-development zoning permits. This aggressive, exorbitant pricing strategy completely short-circuited the victim's logical defenses. The executives subconsciously reasoned that no one would ever have the sheer, staggering audacity to ask for $500,000 for something that wasn't absolutely, demonstrably real. The massive price tag essentially functioned as its own twisted form of authentication. It made the investment feel incredibly real, incredibly exclusive, and incredibly urgent. Sterling would often casually mention that a rival CEO from a competing firm was already looking closely at a specific lunar valley, instantly weaponizing the target's fierce, competitive paranoia. The fear of missing out on the greatest real estate land grab in human history completely overwhelmed their natural business acumen. They weren't just buying the moon, they were actively blocking their rivals from owning it. They signed the heavy parchment deeds with their expensive fountain pens, handed over massive cashier's checks, and proudly locked their worthless pieces of paper away in their heavy steel vaults, entirely convinced that they had just secured the future of their entire family dynasty. Once the very first, highly influential domino fell, the illusion rapidly mutated into an unstoppable, self-sustaining psychological contagion among the 1950s elite. The scam completely bypassed the critical faculties of the business world by infiltrating their most vulnerable, unguarded sanctuary, the exclusive, members-only country club. The ultra-wealthy exist in an incredibly small, highly insular echo chamber, where status is constantly, aggressively negotiated through the subtle display of impossible assets. When a powerful oil tycoon casually mentions over a round of 18 holes that he has just quietly secured the exclusive mineral rights to the Tycho crater, the other men in his foursome do not immediately laugh and call the authorities. They feel a sudden, sharp, agonizing pang of deep inadequacy. The ego simply cannot tolerate being left behind on the launch pad. Sterling didn't even have to actively hunt for new targets anymore. The victims were actively doing the selling for him. They were quietly boasting to their peers in private dining rooms and steam baths, inadvertently acting as unpaid, highly enthusiastic ambassadors for the greatest fraud of the century. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of the transactions began to heavily escalate. These were men who relentlessly scrutinized every single penny on their corporate balance sheets, men who would ruthlessly fire an employee for a minor accounting error. Yet, they were gleefully writing massive, unregulated checks for concepts that physically defied the laws of gravity and international law. They bought highly contested lunar water rights, despite the fact that science had not yet proven the existence of a single drop of water on the moon. They aggressively outbid each other for imaginary commercial transit corridors and high-altitude vacation zoning. One particularly aggressive real estate developer from Chicago reportedly purchased a massive, multi-million-dollar lunar tract simply to ensure that a massive crater could be officially, permanently named after his demanding socialite wife. When we analyze this deeply uncomfortable chapter of history from the safe, highly educated vantage point of the present day, it is incredibly easy to arrogantly mock the victims. We look at the absolute absurdity of a fake moon deed and wonder how anyone, let alone the most powerful men in the country, could be so completely, hopelessly dense. But this is exactly where the vital, authorial intervention of the historian becomes absolutely necessary. You must understand that these men were not biologically stupid. They were completely blinded by the radiant, blinding light of American exceptionalism and the intoxicating promise of the future. They were living in a decade where the absolute impossible was becoming mundane reality on a daily basis. They had watched scientists split the fundamental building blocks of matter. They had watched massive steel airplanes break the sound barrier. They were being bombarded by glossy science fiction magazines and government propaganda, assuring them that commercial space travel was merely a few short years away. Sterling merely took the existing, highly aggressive cultural optimism of the 1950s and expertly weaponized it for his own massive financial gain. He essentially sold them their own deeply held beliefs. He held up a beautifully forged mirror and allowed these titans of industry to see exactly what they desperately wanted to see: a universe where their wealth, their influence, and their power were absolutely infinite, capable of extending far beyond the gravitational pull of the Earth itself. The con worked so flawlessly not because the forgery was perfect, but because the intense, burning desire of the victims to believe in the illusion was infinitely stronger than their desire for the cold, boring truth. They willingly surrendered their logic because the fantasy of lunar dominion was simply too intoxicating to resist. The grand, impossibly arrogant architecture of Sterling's lunar empire did not eventually collapse in a dramatic, Hollywood-style shootout, nor was it meticulously unraveled by a brilliant, hard-boiled detective aggressively connecting strings on a corkboard. Like so many of the most spectacular multi-million-dollar frauds in American history, the absolute destruction of the illusion was triggered by a stunningly mundane, incredibly boring, bureaucratic error. Sterling, a man who possessed the psychological brilliance to successfully sell empty space to billionaires, made a fundamental, deeply arrogant mistake in his terrestrial accounting. He failed to properly launder a relatively minor, insignificant fraction of his massive influx of cash, triggering a highly routine, completely random audit by a low-level, deeply unglamorous clerk at the Internal Revenue Service. This singular, boring thread of tax discrepancy eventually led federal investigators to a massive, hidden safe deposit box in a midtown Manhattan bank. When the authorities finally drilled the heavy steel lock and cracked the box open, they did not find millions in cash. They found the motherlode of evidence, the forged wax seals, the printing plates for the intricate lunar deeds, and, most devastatingly, a meticulously detailed handwritten ledger containing the exact names, the private addresses, and the specific astronomical dollar amounts paid by some of the most powerful, respected, and heavily guarded corporate executives in the United States. The federal authorities prepared for what they assumed would be the absolute trial of the century. They had the physical evidence, they had the ledgers, and they had a massive list of highly credible, high-profile victims ready to testify. But then, something absolutely extraordinary and deeply revealing happened. The trial completely imploded before it ever truly began. When the FBI quietly contacted the powerful men listed in Sterling's private ledger, asking them to formally press charges and take the witness stand against the charismatic con artist, they were met with a unified, terrifying wall of absolute silence. Not a single one of the titans of industry was willing to publicly testify. The psychological trap that Sterling had so brilliantly constructed in the very beginning had finally snapped completely shut. These were men who had built their entire massive empires on their public reputations as shrewd, infallible, and highly dangerous businessmen. The sheer, overwhelming thought of sitting in a brightly lit public courtroom surrounded by eagerly scribbling newspaper reporters and being forced to publicly admit that they had been completely swindled out of millions of dollars for imaginary dirt on the moon by a man in a nice suit was a fate infinitely worse than the financial loss itself. Their massive, fragile egos simply could not, and would not, tolerate the devastating, permanent humiliation. They would rather quietly swallow the massive financial loss and pretend the entire terrifying ordeal never happened than allow the general public to see that the emperor was entirely naked. Because the victims absolutely refused to cooperate or publicly acknowledge the crime, the federal prosecutors were completely paralyzed. Sterling ultimately served a laughably short, almost insulting prison sentence for minor, unrelated tax evasion charges and mail fraud, taking the vast, unrecovered majority of his millions into the shadows with him when he was quietly released. This heavily suppressed, dusty file remains one of the most profound, chilling testaments to the absolute vulnerability of the human mind in the entire archive. It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that immense wealth does not buy immunity from human foolishness, and that the greatest, most impenetrable armor a con artist can ever wear is the massive, fragile ego of his chosen victim. When the desire to feel special, exclusive, and visionary overrides the basic, fundamental instinct for truth, absolutely anything can be sold. Keep questioning the grand narratives you are fed. Keep a very close, skeptical eye on the people who promise you the absolute impossible, and never underestimate the blinding power of a well-dressed lie. If you want to continue helping me pry open these forgotten, deeply uncomfortable vaults of history, make sure you are actively subscribed to the archive. We have so much more ground to cover together, and the illusions are only getting more complex. Next time, we will be pivoting away from the bright, arrogant lights of corporate fraud and descending into a much darker, far more terrifying mystery. We will open the file on the Phantom Broadcaster, a chilling, unsolved case from 1957, where an unknown, ghostly voice managed to completely hijack the radio signals of a quiet, perfect American town, broadcasting their deepest, darkest, and most destructive secrets into the dead of night and vanishing into the static without a single trace. Keep your radios tuned, and remember that the truth is rarely what it appears to be on the surface.